A Mark Brown Arthur chapter book. Arthur Plays the Blues. Text by Stephen Krensky. Based on a teleplay by Catherine Lewin. For all the talented students at the South Shore Conservatory in Hingham. Chapter 1. Wonderful, Arthur, said Mrs. Cardigan. Really? Absolutely. And I should know. Mrs. Cardigan was Arthur's piano teacher, the only one he had ever had. Your fingers are flowing with the keys. Sometimes lightly, sometimes with vigor and strength. But always with feeling. Arthur played a few more notes. Excellent, Mrs. Cardigan went on. You've really got Edelweiss down pat. If I close my eyes, I can see myself in the Austrian Alps. She took a deep breath. Goodness, that air is fresh. Arthur smiled. Should I try the left hand now? In a minute, dear. Mrs. Cardigan opened her eyes and pushed back a strand of her gray hair. We have to talk about something first. Eno, said Arthur, eyes about the other piece. I promise I'll practice it for next time. Mrs. Cardigan sighed. Ah, next time. That's what we have to talk about. I'm afraid there won't be a next time. You see, I'm retiring. Arthur gasped. You're what? She stood up and went into the kitchen. I should have told you before, she called out, but I kept putting it off in case I changed my mind. Arthur blinked a few times. But you haven't? Changed your mind, I mean? No. Mrs. Cardigan shook her head. It's the right thing for me to do. Arthur frowned. But I thought only old people retired. That's sweet, Arthur, said Mrs. Cardigan, returning with a plate of cookies. But the fact is, I am old, or at least a long way from being young. And there are other things I want to do besides teach piano. She handed him a cookie. Here. They're chocolate chip, your favorite. Arthur always looked forward to cookies at the end of his lesson, at least until today. He took one to be polite, but he didn't even taste it when he took a bite. What will happen to me? Asked Arthur. I'll never get to Carnegie Hall without your help. Mrs. Cardigan patted him on the shoulder. Don't be so sure about that. Your new teacher is actually a concert pianist. My new teacher? Arthur repeated. Mrs. Cardigan clasped her hands with excitement. That's right. I've been saving the good news for last. I've made some calls, and you're going to be taught by none other than. She pointed to a poster on the wall of a long-haired man hunched over a grand piano. Dr. Frederic Fugue. Arthur examined the poster closely. Dr. Fugue's expression was very serious. Even his fingers looked serious, perched over the piano keys like an eagle's talons. That's him? Arthur gulped. Indeed it is, said Mrs. Cardigan. Dr. Fugue is very experienced. He's in high demand for concerts, but he always saves time for a few special students. One generation must light the way for the next, he likes to say. Arthur sighed. Well, he may be great, but I'll bet his cookies aren't as good as yours. Chapter 2. Arthur hoped that a good night's sleep would make him feel better about Mrs. Cardigan's news. Unfortunately, it didn't. The next morning his head was still in a swirl. So he went off to the playground thinking a little fresh air might do him some good. He was hanging upside down from the monkey bars when Binky appeared before him. Your face is getting red, said Binky. That's the blood rushing to my head, said Arthur. I'm hoping that will help. Help what? Arthur swung back around so that he could look at Binky right side up. My piano teacher, Mrs. Cardigan, is retiring. The news is making me dizzy. She's the one who bakes the great cookies, right? BrimQ frowned. No wonder you're upset. It's not just that, said Arthur. Everything with Mrs. Cardigan was so comfortable. I know she liked me, and I liked her, too. She didn't give me too much to practice or too little either. Everything was just right. Now I have to start over. He sighed. And I'm worried about my new teacher. You already know who it is? Oh, yes. Arthur folded his arms. Mrs. Cardigan wouldn't want to leave things up in the air. She's very thorough. She's arranged everything with Dr. Fugue. BrimQ's mouth dropped open. Dr. Fugue? No way. Well, yes, said Arthur. I can't believe it, said BrimQ. You're going to be taught by Dr. Frederick Fugue? Boy, some kids get all the breaks. He's that good? Asked Arthur. Good? He's not just good. He's the best. If there were piano teachers on Mount Rushmore, he'd be the first head. I'd give anything for just one lesson with him. Even without the cookies. And I don't even play piano. Really? Arthur looked pleased. I had no idea. I guess it's an honor. Teal say. BrimQ rubbed his chin. Of course, it will be a challenge. Your fingers might break from all the scales he makes you do. It can't be that bad, said Arthur. You're just exaggerating. BrimQ laughed. Am I? Try telling that to my friend Mikey. He took lessons with Dr. Fugue for 3 months, and he still can't hold an ice cream cone with only one hand. Arthur put his own hands in his pockets. Oh, said BrimQ, and one more thing. Watch out for the knitting needles. Knitting needles? Arthur took a deep breath. Dr. Fugue uses knitting needles during the lessons? BrimQ nodded. What for? Arthur asked. You don't want to know. Just make sure you stay on the beat. BrimQ paused. Good old Fugue the ferocious. I admire your courage, Arthur. Arthur frowned. I don't want you admiring my courage. Well, I do, I suppose, but not in this case. I don't want to need courage for piano lessons. Well, it's too late now, said BrimQ. Be brave, be fearless, and most of all, beware. Chapter 3. This is the place. Are you sure? Mr. Red checked his directions. It's the right number. And this is the only old Victorian house on the block. Do you want me to go in with you? Arthur shook his head. No, it'll be okay. He got out of the car and walked to the front door. Before he could even knock, though, the door swung open. A tall, pale man with long limp hair stood before him. He extended a spidery hand in welcome. Arthur Reed, I presume. That's me. Arthur extended his own hand, but instead of shaking, Dr. Fugue pulled Arthur's hand up to his nose for a closer look. Moderate digital spreading and no calluses. I imagine you've been playing for 2.5 years. Yes, said Arthur. Thought so, said Dr. Fugue. Follow me. As they went inside, Arthur heard his father honking a farewell. Dr. Fugue cringed. Eck! C-sharp. He should get that tuned. They moved on to the living room. Arthur noticed holes in the rug and stuffing coming out of the wing chair. A bird tweeted in a cage by the window. Dr. Fugue clapped his hands at her. Adagio, Tosca, adagio. The bird looked nervous and tweeted more slowly. Although the rest of the room was a mess, the grand piano was a gleaming masterpiece. "Wow," said Arthur. "It's beautiful." Dr. Fugue ran a finger over its surface, checking for dust. "Her name is Giselle. She's been around the world with me from Vienna to Carnegie Hall." Arthur's mouth dropped open. "You've actually played at Carnegie Hall?" Yes, many times. But that's enough chit-chat. Let's hear you play." Arthur sat down at the piano while Dr. Fugue paced behind him. "We'll start with some scales. D major." Arthur began to play. "All right. Now C harmonic major. A minor. D major again." The time flew by, but Arthur had no chance to notice. He was too busy jumping from one demand to another. "Tempa! Tempa! Tempa!" snapped Dr. Fugue. Finally, when Arthur felt like his fingers might begin falling off his hands altogether, Dr. Fugue said the magic words. "And stop." Arthur took a deep breath. Then another. And a third. "That'll do for today. It appears that you might actually have some talent, Mr. Red. Therefore, I'd like you to work on this for next week's lesson." He handed Arthur a book of music. Arthur gasped. "But this is Bach's two-part Inventions. It has, like, 1,000,000 notes." No, only 8,955. And each of them is perfect. Let's begin with the invention in F major." Arthur stood up from the piano. I'm not so sure I can." He stopped because Dr. Fugue had reached into a basket and pulled out a pair of knitting needles. Genius is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. So, naturally, you must practice. Now, what were you saying? Arthur's face had paled. Nothing. Invention in F major. Right. He snatched up his coat, mumbled a hasty goodbye, and ran out the front door. Chapter 4. Arthur sat at his piano, staring at the music in front of him. 8,955 notes, he muttered. Mrs. Cardigan would never have given me something so hard. Just looking at this makes me tired. He closed his eyes, but instead of seeing blackness, a line of half notes and quarter notes danced in front of him. Wee-ee. Arthur opened his eyes. That was D.W.'s voice. It was coming from outside. Arthur got up and looked out the window. Just to make sure she's all right, he told himself. D.W. seemed to be fine. She had collected a large pile of leaves and was jumping in them. Wee! She shouted again. Arthur frowned. It wasn't fair that he should be cooped up inside while D.W. had all the fun. Besides, when it came to jumping in leaves, her technique was not perfect. A little sister could use a big brother's greater experience to guide her. And out he went. The next day Arthur planned to practice again, but Francine rang the doorbell just as he was heading for the piano. She wanted to play football, and how could he let down a friend in need? 2 days later there was a book fair. Arthur couldn't miss that. Everyone knew how important reading was. Arthur made sure he explored the fair from one end to the other. It didn't take many more excuses before 5 days had passed. On Saturday morning Arthur was making breakfast and outlining his day. First I'm going to help Buster carve his pumpkin. Then I'll... Hold on a minute, Arthur, said his mother. I think you're forgetting something. Oh, right, Mom. Buster asked me to bring that special carving tool. I didn't mean that. I mean the piano. You do remember the piano, don't you? Of course, Arthur said slowly, the dancing notes appearing again in his head. Well, your lesson with Dr. Fugue is in 2 days, and I don't think you've practiced at all. Well, I've thought about practicing, said Arthur. I've thought about it a lot. Doesn't that count? Do you think it will count with Dr. Fugue? Asked his father. An image of knitting needles suddenly replaced the dancing notes in Arthur's head. No, he admitted, I guess not. And this is your first real lesson together, his mother reminded him. You want to make a good impression. I didn't have to worry about that with Mrs. Cardigan. It's not fair. His mother smiled. You may not remember, Arthur, but there was a time when playing for Mrs. Cardigan made you nervous, too. 1 hour, said Mr. Red. Your fingers will thank you. What about? Buster's pumpkin can wait. And you'll have to do another hour tonight to really catch up. But. No buts, Arthur. Mr. Reed stared at him. Finish your cereal and get going. Chapter 5. Arthur sat down at the piano, an oven timer at his side. He set it for 1 hour. 60 minutes and counting, he said. He started to play, trying a few notes with only his right hand.